So trees and drawing trees, painting trees, for a long time artists have tried to accurately draw trees and encapsulate the sort of majesty of these big oxygenating brutes. If you want accuracy, take a photo. I really mean that. We're not doing photorealism, we don't do it on this channel. I've decided we're gonna talk about sketching a tree, how to capture simply the essence of a tree, some of its characteristics, in a way that is pleasing and fun and quick. Some trees of different sizes, different characteristics. And we can start off with the very basics. We can start off by representing trees as what I call lollipops. So let's have a look at some simple trees and how we can sort of vary the detail. Now, if you were going to draw some trees in the background there, you know, on the far distance, there's a horizon about a third of the way up. And let's just really quickly draw some trees. Now, you can go super simple with these. There's a technique. You can see I'm going to hold the pen at the back here that I use, and it's sort of like lollipop trees. So some trees are obviously tall and some trees are sort of that shape. And as you can see, I'm using a sort of continuous line method. And that's really as simple as you can be. You know, you can be really, really, really truly the brief when it comes to sort of describing shapes. If you wanted to do something a little bit more detailed, you could be a bit more specific and just do like a single line. So say, for example, this one is roughly sort of square, getting a bit more detail in terms of lines. Tree. Okay, and then, so if it seems like I'm sort of being a bit obvious here, my point being is when trees are far away, you don't actually have to do loads of detail. So let's evolve this a little bit further and start to do a little bit more detail. Well, this is going to take a little bit longer. No, I'm obviously just making this up as I go. I'm going to start to introduce a bit more shape here. And I might even add in a little bit like that. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting to look at that silhouette a bit more. And when it comes to adding in the detail, I'm still simplifying it. So let's continue with this. Let's continue our journey here. So we have super simple here. And then we have this, which is a sort of silhouette. Is that how you spell silhouette? And then it continues to more of a silhouette shape. So let's go and add some more. Let's see if we can go a bit more detailed again. So the next stage really for this one, I might not draw all the trees for this, but the next stage I would do even more detailed. Again, I'm using this sort of continuous line method. Try and keep it quite random, because obviously trees do tend to look a little bit random. And what I might do is just do some little bit of extra shapes like that. And then I might do some little holes in the foliage. And you can even do some little gaps where you can see branches coming through like that. And then that for this conifer, this kind of lollipop shaped one, would perhaps be something a little bit more regular. So that's the idea with a slightly more advanced one, is you can add in some extra little bits which kind of suggest those little blobs that you get around the outside of the silhouette of a tree. And then you could actually go further than that and start to add in some sort of detail of the tree, you know, some of its structure. So what you're really doing here is you're starting to look at how the branches are going to be working inside the tree. And when it comes to adding paint on this, you can kind of cover those up or not. And then you would do the same where you would add in, again, with some little extra bits around the edge. And again, you can add in some areas where you can sort of see some of the branches. And then when you come to put colour on this, you're going to be covering up some of those areas. And once you get to this stage of the detail, you know, sometimes it's nice to use a bit of heavier line work on the bottom of the tree, or even some sort of shadow or something. So basically this is a little bit like this version, but you just have a little bit more of those branches coming through. And then you can go another step further in the detail and do what I would consider to be breaking up the foliage. So instead of it just being one bit, what you actually have is more realistic foliage. So you have lots of bits. You might even want to put some under there. So what I'm doing is I'm breaking up the tree into several components and overlapping them a little. So then between those areas, you can go and add in some branch details. I'm going to put a bit of cross hatching on here just to sort of hint at where you can add in some depth, you know, some shade. So again, I mean, this sounds, you know, it may sound a bit blooming obvious, you know, that you can do this, but sometimes I think it's nice just to point out to people that there's many ways of drawing trees, and that actually sometimes one of the nice things is having a play with all these different ways of doing them. I mean, I do some really super simple ones and try and do some that are a little bit more complicated. Now, if you're just drawing trees that are in the background, you wouldn't necessarily do anything more detailed than that. And if your tree was a pine tree, you wouldn't necessarily break it down into loads of different parts, but they do tend to overlap where you have one bit overlapping another. So it might look sort of something a little bit like that. And there might be a bit where you see the trunk, you know, going up the middle. And these are little, you know, caricatures, yes, but it's a shorthand and a simplification. And so if that was your silhouette, and this is I guess it would be a silhouette with extras, and then we have more detail, and then this is it's not a whole canopy, so don't know how I'd describe that, but you know, you're sort of breaking it up into shapes. I'll just put more shapes. So as you can see, there is a million different ways, and you can also incorporate some of these branch details into, you know, these if you wanted to do that. You know, a lollipop with some branches sticking up. And also you could do the same with that one. So yeah, I would recommend you look at the way a lot of artists draw trees. You know, I think there's some really interesting people out there who are drawing trees. The urban sketching scene has some fantastic variation really in how different people tackle these different subjects. So these are the Porter Valley sketches of all the bridges in the Porter Valley from Hunter's Bar up. And you can see these are quite quick. A lot of these have been sketched on plein air, so I've been actually there. Then in the background, these are very quick sketches, and some of them were complete experiments in terms of colour and just play. You can see again the more detailed in the foreground. I love some of these branches, they work really well. Not so much. And then as we get further in the background, there's more vague shapes. What I'm doing in some of these, which actually, you know, I've kind of forgotten about this technique. I'm just creating some cross-hatched areas where they're sort of silhouettes almost. Quite a lot of detail in this one. This is a good example of using the thick lines in the foreground to try and bring stuff forward a little bit. And the different types of foliage in the foreground here is quite detailed, and obviously the stuff in the background not at all. Here I'm playing with some white gel pen. I'm not sure what's going on really there. It's a horrible, really weird composition. This is ink. This is just ink here. I've not used watercolor on that. A really simple, little lovely sketch. I'm not even sure about that orange on there. I think just a little bit of ink on there is fine, but you can see the sort of principle here of working primarily on the detail on the foreground. I've even got some leaf shapes and a little bit of detail on the leaf. And then this midground, which could be less detail in fairness, I think that probably would help if it was. And then less detail back here. And likewise for this one, it's again an unusual composition for me, but the detail in the foreground and then going back into the softness further back. I think I knew what I was trying to do with that, but I don't think it necessarily worked particularly well. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm using a sketchbook to try things and just to really try some different techniques. So yeah, interesting little project, but I think it was doing that really helped me come up with ideas about foliage that were a kind of combination of some of the stuff that I liked from other people's art and some of my own ideas. So here, this is sort of looking down a lane in Cornwall to a place called St. Clement, and you can see some of the foreground foliage is being more detailed, and it gets the shape, it changes as you go down. And then I'm actually using some acrylic pen here in the tree to try and do some leaf detail without drawing it all. And then in the foreground on the right hand side, it's an unusual composition. This is a bit of an experiment again. I'm doing some very big bits of foliage, but not colouring it in so they really pop. So before we wrap this up, I want to talk a little bit about texture of foliage and grasses. Again, this is just a little made up drawing looking down. Let's just say it's a country lane. So I'm going to do a very simple composition with it going into the middle and draw some dots. And that'll give me a bit of a guide. Okay, so what we've got here is, let's start with the foreground. So we're looking down a country lane and there's grass growing in the middle of the road. It's an old, maybe a trackway going down to a farmer's field. So let's put a gate in at the end, like that. Now everything's going to end up going to the gate. All our lines, sort of perspective is going to be working that way. So in the foreground, we're going to have some stuff. So what we're going to have in the foreground, we're going to have some grass. So I'm going to draw some grass in. Now you can draw grass anywhere you want. There's a million different methods. You really don't have to draw it like I'm drawing it. You can do sort of like scrubs like that. I'll put some green on there, doesn't matter. Sometimes a line like that's quite nice. You can draw something that's like that. There's loads of ways you can draw grass. I mean, it's, oops. But I'm going to draw something that looks vaguely like this here. And then coming out of there, I'm going to draw some flowers because it's my picture and I can put flowers in it if I want. And I'm going to draw some daisies like that. And then I might keep going, just populate this foreground, maybe draw some more flowers. And I'm using this semi-continuous line method. And let's draw some sort of clover bits, which I like, stuff like that. And then some tufts of like grass. There we go. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a sort of foreground texture with my flowers, grasses, clover, maybe some other stuff. You could even put a nettle in here. But again, what I'm doing is I'm making the foreground detailed. So we're looking down the middle of the track here, and as we get further back, the grass is going to get less and less detailed until we get back here. It's just sort of a few dots, maybe some bigger stuff. But then this edge is a sort of rough shape, and maybe further back it could just be some dots, some lines like that. But as we get further forward, it starts to take on a few more grassy characteristics. That's it. So as we get further forward, you can actually start to have the odd tuft of grass in it. As you see, I'm developing that line work as we get further forward. So that's looking down the middle of the road here. And I'm going to do the same here. So I'm going to put in a bit more detail here, quite close in. And I'm going to make some suggestions of some grassy bits coming down here. And then as we get further down, the same with as I've done here, those just become some dots. And then this bit comes down here like this. And again, in the foreground, we're going to do a lot more detail. So here we might have some stones on the path. And as we get further down, they're going to get smaller. And then here, they might just be tiny. And then as we get further down, there's going to be some dots. And the same on this side. So here we have a stone wall that comes down. And as we get further back, it gets more and more textured. This grass verge is a bit more irregular now. So with the wall, we're going to start off in the foreground, giving it lots of texture. This is a dry stone wall, which you get in the UK. I'm sure your local vernacular will have something similar, or maybe fences. So in the foreground, we'll start off with quite a lot of detail, and then as we get further back, it might become more minimal. But again, I'm making the details smaller as we go. And then maybe as we get back here, it'll just be some dots. So I hope you're getting the idea here. I mean, this is a very speedy representation, but in the foreground, we've got some quite big details, and we're making sure that we're overlapping some of this grass detail. And then as we get further back, it just becomes more and more minimal. As we get further away from you, the viewer, the textures become less and less. So the main place to really think about the foliage is when it's close to you, and then you can be really concentrate on that detail. So finally, so I hope you enjoyed that. There's obviously on my Patreon, there is full-length videos where I go into the more specific details of how to draw trees and lots of videos about those kind of specific things. This is a video that's trying to cover a lot very quickly, but I think it's a really good way of making people think really about stuff they hadn't perhaps thought about before maybe. So I hope you enjoyed that, and like, subscribe, all that jazz. and I'll see you for the next one, which I believe is drawing buildings, I think. I think I said it wrong last week when I said it was buildings this week and it's not, it's trees. So sorry for that. All right, see you next time. Bye-bye.